Imagine, if you will, a man so consumed by his desire for power, he would betray the very brotherhood that once gave his life meaning.
My name's Pat Matter, and I was the president of the Minneapolis Hells Angels for 21 years.
For 21 years, he ruled the Minneapolis chapter of the Hells Angels with an iron fist, building a methamphetamine empire that netted him $3 million a year. But behind the leather, chrome, and infamous death head patch lies a tale of loyalty, betrayal, and redemption that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the biker culture.
This is the story of Pat Matter, the notorious president of the Minneapolis Hells Angels, a man whose journey from outlaw to informant shook the biker world to its core.
From a 7th grade dropout to the president of one of the most feared motorcycle clubs in America, Pat Matter's journey is a roller coaster of extreme highs and devastating lows. It's a tale of power, violence, and ultimately the price of loyalty.
That morning, the hardest thing I ever did was drop my son off knowing I wasn't going to see him at home again for a long time.
Picture the quiet, modest town of Fort Dodge, Iowa in the 1950s. This was where Pat Matter's story began, with a population of around 10,000. Fort Dodge was far removed from the hustle and bustle of major cities.
My name's Pat Matter, and I was the president of Minneapolis Hells Angels for 21 years. People don't understand belonging to an organization like the Hells Angels. I mean, there's a bond there. It's your life. I mean, that was my whole life. My mom and dad divorced in the 50s. I lived in Fort Dodge, Iowa with...
School offered little solace for Pat. Academics weren't a priority, and the structure of the educational system seemed ill-suited to his restless spirit.
But my mother left me, and I had to quit school in the 7th grade. Just kind of basically raised myself.
When I was 15, my friend Ron Linder and I broke into a bar in Clare, Iowa, and stole a bunch of beer and cigarettes and got caught. It was my first arrest.
Despite the chaos at home and the trouble at school, there was one thing that sparked a sense of passion and purpose in young Pat: motorcycles. And his troubled adolescence only drove him further in search of belonging and stability, a search that would eventually lead him to the world of motorcycle clubs. Unlike the polished showroom models, Pat was captivated by the raw, unfiltered power of the gritty, greasy machines. He spent countless hours tinkering with engines, finding solace and a sense of belonging in the hum of the motor and the open road. He found a sanctuary in the world of motorcycles. This burgeoning fascination introduced Pat to the rough biker scene in Fort Dodge. Here, amidst the clinking of beer bottles and the camaraderie of fellow enthusiasts, Pat discovered a brotherhood that filled the void left by his fractured family.
I went around with some friends there in Fort Dodge that were bikers. So they took me in, and that's how I ended up really loving the club thing.
By immersing himself in this world, Pat found not only an escape from his troubled adolescence, but also a new identity.
The young boy who had once felt lost and abandoned now found himself part of a brotherhood that valued loyalty and respect above all else.
This newfound sense of belonging was intoxicating, and it would set the stage for Pat's deeper involvement in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs. As the 1950s drew to a close, Pat's life was poised for a dramatic transformation. The troubled boy from Fort Dodge was on the cusp of entering a world where the roar of motorcycle engines would soon be accompanied by the darker sounds of criminal enterprise. Yet, in those early years, it was the simple joy of riding and the camaraderie of his biker friends that defined Pat's existence. This was the beginning of a journey that would see him rise to the ranks of one of the most notorious motorcycle clubs in history, but also face the moral and legal battles that would eventually lead him to a life-altering decision. Fast forward to the 1960s.
They had a club called the Grim Reapers. The club, they knew I would stand behind them. I was a fighter.
This club wasn't part of the notorious Hells Angels yet, but they shared the same outlaw spirit. By 1969, the Grim Reapers were patched over to become the first Hells Angels chapter in Minnesota. Pat, now 19, was thrust into a powerful criminal empire. The Hells Angels were involved in drugs, weapons, and violence. This was a brotherhood with a dark side, and Pat was diving in headfirst. Pat's skills and loyalty earned him respect quickly, but the true turning point came with a tragic event: the death of his best friend, Rick Wingerson, in a biker shootout.
Rick, my best friend, and I were out bar hopping. When we come up to a bar named Krinnigan's, some guys were walking out. They had guns. They pulled them out immediately as soon as they seen me and Rick. It was just so fast. Rick got hit. And I kind of grabbed him. My hand actually went into the wound. He was dead then because it went right through the heart. I felt pretty bad about that. You know, it took me a while to get over it. But it just made me want to be a Grim Reaper that much more because Rick gave his life for it. And he believed in brotherhood, and he was there because of that.
This solidified Pat's path. He wasn't just a part of this world. He was now deeply entrenched in it. By the late 1960s, Pat had started a lucrative meth trafficking business, pulling in millions of dollars a year.
I did it relatively fast, from $400 a week to probably $3 million a year selling methamphetamine.
The Hells Angels had given him the belonging he craved.
We became Hells Angels in September 18th, 1982. I mean, we were so happy. I can't even tell you how I felt. I'll never forget it as long as I live. When I opened up the charter in '82, it also opened up opportunities selling methamphetamine.
But it all came at a heavy cost.
Being a Hells Angel, I went through 2 marriages. I mean, I gave up so much, I lost track of what I was supposed to be doing at home.
Being part of the Hells Angels was not just about the thrill of the ride or the camaraderie of the club. It was about power, control, and survival in a world where violence and criminal activity were the norms. The Hells Angels offered Pat a new sense of purpose. However, this new life also meant constant danger and a growing list of enemies.
But there were other rivals that wanted to have me gone. I could have got killed real easy, let's put it that way. It started a war. When I say war, I'm talking about people dying.
During this period, Pat's involvement in the Hells Angels deepened. He became known for his mechanical skills and his ability to build custom bikes that were both powerful and visually striking. His shop, Minneapolis Custom Cycle, became a hub for motorcycle enthusiasts and a front for his growing criminal activities. The shop's reputation for quality craftsmanship drew customers from across the Midwest, blending Pat's love for motorcycles with the edgy allure of the Hells Angels. However, no matter how much Pat tried to prioritize motorcycle culture, the outlaw life seeped into every aspect of his existence. The 1970s were a brutal era for the Hells Angels' drug trafficking operations, marked by a vicious turf war with their arch-rivals, the Outlaws MC. This lethal backdrop created a dangerous duality in Pat's life. He was both a respected motorcycle craftsman and a criminal narco-trafficker, trying to balance dual passions that ultimately could not coexist.
As the 1970s drew to a close, Pat's life was a precarious balancing act, one that would soon be tested by the growing pressures from law enforcement and the escalating violence within the biker world.
The 1970s and 1980s were chaotic times for Pat Matter. His deep dive into the criminal underworld meant the Hells Angels operations were expanding and growing, increasingly violent. Even though Pat had a passion for motorcycles and was a successful custom bike builder, the outlaw life engulfed him. The duality of his existence blurred the lines between his legitimate business and his criminal activities. During this period, Pat's shop, Minneapolis Custom Cycle, became renowned for producing some of the finest custom motorcycles in the Midwest.
His Hells Angels chapter was the envy of other outlaw motorcycle gangs. And his custom motorcycle shop, his one business that had eventually become legitimate, had been featured nationally in countless cycle magazines.
The 1970s and 1980s saw brutal turf wars between the Hells Angels and their arch rivals, the Outlaws MC. The conflict between these two gangs was intense and violent, with shootouts, firebombings, and brawls becoming commonplace. The Hells Angels and the Outlaws were locked in a vicious battle for control of the lucrative drug trade and other illegal activities. Pat found himself caught in the middle of this deadly feud, witnessing close friends killed in the crossfire and facing constant threats to his own life.
One of the most significant challenges Pat faced during this time was balancing his passion for motorcycles with his involvement in the Hells Angels criminal activities. Despite his success as a custom bike builder, the outlaw life infiltrated every aspect of his existence.
The 1970s and 1980s were also a time of increased law enforcement scrutiny. Federal authorities, particularly Captain Chris Omott, were relentlessly tracking the Hells Angels' activities. Omott, a dedicated and tenacious investigator, was determined to bring down the Hells Angels and dismantle their criminal empire. He meticulously gathered evidence on the gang's drug trafficking operations, weapons smuggling, and other illicit activities, with Pat Matter often in his crosshairs.
If you're going to do a good case, you better know who you're going after. With Pat, I studied everything I could on him. And we all suspected him of dealing drugs, particularly methamphetamine. But Pat was a really good drug dealer. He flew below the radar.
This period, Pat's leadership within the Hells Angels grew. His mechanical skills and business acumen made him a valuable asset to the club, and his loyalty earned him the respect of his peers. However, his increasing involvement in the gang's criminal activities also made him a target for law enforcement. The escalating turf war between the Hells Angels and the Outlaws added to the tension. The violence between the two gangs reached new heights, with shootouts, bombings, and brutal assaults becoming commonplace. Pat found himself caught in the middle of this deadly conflict, witnessing the deaths of close friends and facing constant threats to his own life. The constant danger and the brutal realities of the outlaw life weighed heavily on him, further complicating his already precarious existence.
Despite these challenges, Pat remained committed to the Hells Angels. The sense of belonging and the camaraderie that the club provided were powerful motivators, and Pat was determined to uphold the values of loyalty and brotherhood that defined the Hells Angels. However, the increasing pressure from law enforcement and the escalating violence within the biker world made it clear that Pat's dual existence was becoming increasingly untenable.
Becoming the Hells Angels president. By the 1980s, Pat Matter's unique combination of craftsmanship, business acumen, and decades of unwavering loyalty had elevated him to a revered position within the Hells Angels hierarchy. His Minneapolis custom cycle shop was renowned for producing some of the finest custom motorcycles in the Midwest, blending high-quality craftsmanship with the edgy allure of the Hells Angels. However, Pat's success in the legitimate business world was always overshadowed by his deepening involvement in the gang's criminal activities. In 1980, the president of the Minnesota chapter of the Hells Angels was arrested on racketeering charges, thrusting Pat into a leadership role he never desired. At just 30 years old, Pat was now responsible for navigating the chapter through a tumultuous period marked by intense law enforcement scrutiny and escalating violence within the biker world. Balancing the outlaw credibility of the club with the need to avoid drawing too much heat from the authorities became a constant struggle. Federal authorities, led by the relentless Captain Chris Omott, were determined to bring down the Hells Angels and dismantle their criminal empire. Omot meticulously gathered evidence on the gang's drug trafficking operations, weapon smuggling, and other illicit activities, with Pat Matter often in his crosshairs.
When I'm investigating someone, I become intensely focused. Pat might have known who I was, but I could guarantee I knew more about him.
The constant push and pull between maintaining the club's outlaw ethos and steering clear of legal trouble put Pat in a precarious position. The 1980s were also a time of increasing violence between the Hells Angels and their arch rivals, the Outlaws.
The Outlaws are one of the nation's largest motorcycle gangs and one of the most violent. The Outlaws are believed to make large profits from drugs.
The Outlaws are another motorcycle club that the Hells Angels don't get along with, and it's something that probably will never end because of membership being so stubborn on both parts.
The bitter turf war between the two gangs again reached new heights, with shootouts, bombings, and brutal assaults becoming commonplace. Pat found himself caught in the middle of this deadly conflict, witnessing the deaths of close friends and facing constant threats to his own life.
That night, I was at the clubhouse and got a phone call, and on the other end of the line, the guy says, how many members does it take to have a charter? 6, well, you're 1 short in Rockford. And then he hung up. I don't know who it was, but it definitely was one of the Outlaws. It was pretty sad. Monty was a very, very well-liked, respected gentleman. Now, the war with the Outlaws is escalating, and they made another move again.
Despite the challenges, Pat tried to navigate the chapter through this turbulent period. His calm demeanor and business acumen made him a respected leader, but the pressures from law enforcement and the escalating violence within the biker world made it clear that Pat's dual existence was becoming increasingly untenable.
Pat's leadership was marked by a constant struggle to balance the outlaw credibility of the club with the need to avoid drawing too much heat from the authorities. Captain Chris Omot was obsessively tracking the Hells Angels' criminal activities.
There was a high-rise across the interstate from their clubhouse, and we were able to get a room in that high-rise near the top floor, and we had cameras up there. We'd surveil them. If you're going to do a good case, you better know who you're going after.
No longer was motorcycle brotherhood the only priority. Pat's two worlds were colliding, as in a vice, his very identity and freedom at stake. As the 1990s drew to a close, Pat found himself at a crossroads. The pressures from law enforcement and the constant threat of violence were taking a toll on him, and he began to question his path. The duality of his life as a respected motorcycle craftsman and a criminal arco trafficker was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Pat's journey was reaching a critical juncture, one that would soon force him to make a life-altering decision. The Hells Angels versus the Outlaws, Part 2. The 1990s marked a period of escalating violence and mounting pressure for Pat Matter and the Hells Angels. The bitter turf war with the Outlaws motorcycle gang reached new heights, with both clubs locked in a relentless fight for Midwest dominance. This deadly conflict was characterized by bombings, shootings, and murders, as each side sought to outdo the other in a brutal cycle of retaliation.
A guy that was buying a bike from me wanted me to ride in his new Lincoln. He talked me out of driving my pickup. We were about 3 blocks from the shop, and we hear this loud explosion. It was my truck, and it was C4 encased in a steel 9x6 with a mercury-activated switch with aluminum on the top, so the blast would have been directed straight up under the driver's seat. I could have got killed real easy, let's put it that way. I knew it was the Outlaws, and I knew it was Taco. When this bomb went off, that put me in a position I really never wanted to be in. Now I gotta do something. Something had to happen.
One of the most significant flashpoints in this conflict occurred in 1994 when Pat attempted to expand the Hells Angels' footprint into the Outlaws' Chicago territory by patching over the Hells Henchmen gang.
Now, the Hells Henchmen were in Rockford, Illinois, South Bend, Indiana, and 4 chapters of them in Chicago area. They're a big club. Pat was the one that went down and talked to them, and they all decided, hey, we want to be Hells Angels.
They wanted to be Hells Angels. I figured they should have that chance.
This move was seen as an unacceptable encroachment on the Outlaws' territory and led to violent confrontations.
And as soon as the Outlaws got wind of that, that really pissed them off because it was in Chicago, their home charter. The Outlaws didn't want another major club, especially the Hells Angels in Chicago.
The Outlaws' infamous leader, Taco Bowman, personally confronted Pat multiple times, warning him against further expansion. Despite the intervention of Hells Angels legends like Sonny Barger, the tension between the two gangs continued to escalate. The Outlaws responded to the Hells Angels' expansion with a series of violent attacks, including the 1994 bombing of the new Hells Henchmen Chicago clubhouse.
The Hells Henchmen clubhouse in Chicago.
Pieces of the destroyed Ford Taurus are visible more than 2 blocks from the explosion. In between are shattered windows, burned car parts, and holes blasted through nearby buildings.
It was a big bomb. It was like the 3rd in the United States history.
In retaliation, Pat ordered strikes against the Outlaws, including firebombing their properties. The violence spiraled, with both clubs suffering significant casualties.
The Hells Angels never thought about backing out. And the Hells Henchmen weathered through it. You got members being killed, they're being stalked. But they stuck it out, and they knew they was being scrutinized for trying to be Hells Angels.
Amidst this chaos, federal authorities intensified their efforts to dismantle the Hells Angels. Captain Chris Omott, leading the charge, meticulously gathered evidence on the gang's activities. His investigation focused on the Hells Angels' drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and other criminal enterprises.
The war's been going back and forth. You got the killing of members, you got the bombing. There's a lot of pressure to get this thing stalled or stopped.
It is a game of cat and mouse, I was under surveillance by law enforcement for what I was doing.
By the late 1990s, Pat's situation had reached a critical point. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, fearing both rival attacks and police raids.
I had to think about what I was getting into and what I was doing, but I wasn't going to quit in the middle. You got to remember, Hells Angels is number 1. The family comes second.
This was a critical error for him. Pat lost it, and that was his critical mistake. It wasn't a solid case by any means, but we were able to get some people to come forward about what happened and how they were threatened by the Hells Angels. That's how we got to Pat.
When they raided the house, they used that motorcycle thing as a warrant.
Our task force raided the Hells Angels clubhouse.
Pat's loyalty to the Hells Angels had been unwavering for over 30 years, but the impossibility of keeping his two worlds separate began to erode his steadfast commitment.
They finally put together enough of a case to charge me with continuous criminal enterprise.
The constant danger and the looming threat of a lengthy prison sentence weighed heavily on him.
November 25th was my sentencing date, and that morning, the hardest thing I ever did was drop my son off knowing I wasn't going to see him at home again for a long time.
The allure of an ordinary life, free from the fear and violence that had defined his existence, became increasingly appealing.
It was a really hard decision, but I chose my family over that.
Ultimately, Pat made the unthinkable decision to cooperate with authorities and become an informant. Captain Chris Omott, who had pursued Pat and the Hells Angels for years, was stunned by Pat's offer. The information Pat provided, detailed insights into the gang's drug networks, leadership structures, and extortion methods, was invaluable in cracking the Hells Angels' code of silence.
Pat's betrayal shattered the sacred code of the Hells Angels. His testimony directly led to the convictions of multiple members, including national leadership, on charges like drug trafficking and racketeering. It was a landmark victory for law enforcement, but it came at a great personal cost to Pat. Branded a traitor by the very brotherhood that had been his entire life's purpose, Pat's decision to turn informant marked the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another. Pat Matter's choice to cooperate with law enforcement came at a heavy personal cost. He was branded a traitor by the Hells Angels and faced the harsh reality of being ostracized by the very brotherhood that had once provided him with a sense of belonging and purpose. The decision to turn informant was not made lightly, but it ultimately allowed Pat to escape the never-ending cycle of violence and fear that had defined his life. In 2014, after serving a reduced sentence of 10 years due to his cooperation, Pat Matter walked out of prison a free man. Rebuilding his life in anonymity was not easy. After being a larger-than-life figure in the Hells Angels, transitioning to a quiet existence isolated from his former self was extraordinarily difficult. He struggled with loneliness, purposelessness, and adjusting to mundane routines that had been so foreign amid the frenetic adrenaline of his former life. However, slowly, Pat began to find peace. Free from the constraints of the club, he could reconnect with the man he had been before becoming a Hells Angel. He rediscovered his humanity, autonomy, and independence that had been lost in the shadow of the outlaw life. A clearing of mental shadows emerged for the first time in years, and Pat began to see a path forward. An irony in Pat's world is that his deepest support came from an unlikely source, Captain Chris Omott. The once adversarial relationship evolved into a remarkable friendship, with Omott helping Pat adjust to a normal life. Having witnessed how consuming the outlaw biker environment was firsthand, Omott became a source of guidance, helping Pat navigate the complexities of his new existence. Many details of Pat's current circumstances remain private to protect the fresh start he worked so hard to achieve. However, his story, from childhood hardship to the notorious outlaw life and eventual rebirth into something more human, stands as a powerful cautionary tale.
I look back and what I see is that I made the right decision. I got to experience other things in life which I would have never done when I was a Hells Angel. As far as regrets, I was very proud of being a Hells Angel, and that's who I was at that time, and I did it to the best of my ability. The only one who could judge me is God now.
For a deeper understanding of Pat Matter's life and the intricacies of the outlaw biker world, his book, Breaking the Code, offers a raw and unfiltered look at his extraordinary journey. His story is not just a tale of crime and betrayal, but one of resilience, transformation, and the enduring quest for a sense of belonging.